So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the virtual version of the Writer Center. As we mentioned, various living rooms and home offices and other places as well. But we're really glad you can join us today. It's always nice to see a lot of local people today, but also seeing a few people coming in from around the country. I think I saw at least one New Yorker on the list as well, including our guest who is also in New York today, our honoree for the day. For those who don't know us real well, the Writers Center is a literary arts nonprofit. We're headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland, just about 1.5 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And we support writers and everyone who wants to write. We do hundreds of workshops, dozens of free events. And if this is your first time joining us, we really hope it won't be the last. We do free virtual events and free in-person events throughout the year. So if you enjoy what we have here today, please check out our other offerings as well. You can go to our website, writer.org, to see everything we have to offer. And again, we really hope that we'll keep seeing things going forward. It's always a pleasure to see new faces, and of course, always a pleasure to see familiar ones as well. So we're here today to honor the winner of the first novel prize. That is, pulling up my notes here real quick, the McLaughlin-Esstman-Stearns First Novel Prize. I want to make sure I got all those names in the right order. So every year the center gives this award, and this year we're just really, really honored to have our debut novelist, Robert Shuster, whose novel To Zenzi was really just a pleasure to discover through this contest and to pass around the office for us. And I'm sure everyone who's read it through this process has really, really enjoyed it. So we're really pleased that you're here today. And to talk a little bit more about the prize and this novel in particular, we're really honored to have one of our judges, Barbara Esstman. And I'll hand off to you, Barbara, to share the comments from the judges and anything else you want to share about this wonderful contest we host every year.
Hey, thanks, Zach. First of all, thanks to Neal Gillen for founding and funding the First Novel Prize in support of new fiction writers. Those of us that were recognized were honored to be named, and his generous gift makes this evening possible. Second, congratulations to Robert L. Shuster for his fine novel, To Zenzi, our winner for this year. My first reaction was, oh no, not another Second World War novel. I mean, haven't we done this? I had the same reaction when everybody started writing the clones of Eat, Pray, Love. And I was like, stop it, stop it. So you cannot tell me how relieved I was when I started reading this. And from the very first line, it goes wild. It's such good writing. Margaret Backus, our judge ably filling in for the late, great Ann McLaughlin, calls it a memorable first novel that combines history and fantasy, reality and imagination. Lynn Stearns, our other judge, wrote, Shuster gives the reading much more than a coming-of-age story, as Zenzi and Tobias move from childhood into adulthood, all via fresh, illuminating language in a world where war forces them to mature. I concur with their impressions of To Zenzi as a well-researched, original work that creates a rich and textured world. I like the protagonist's point of view covers both his youthful self, trying to make sense of the insanity of Germany in ruins, and his older self at 84, looking back on that time. But my favorite aspect of this novel is the rock-solid prose that begins with, please read all of this, and then marches through to the end with never a space in the narrative that will allow a reader to wander off. An amazing authority in the voice and an internal logic to how the story is told grabs you and doesn't let go. We are pleased to award this year's prize to such a well-wrought novel that tells such an intense story with such masterful skill. And it is amazing as a first novel. It is so well put together. I read a lot of stuff. I am just picky and jaded, and I was so happy to read this book. I did not once want to throw it across the room and scream obscenities, which I often do when reading things. So thank you for such a lovely book. It was amazing. And they can all tell you I'm really crappy about reading. So, you did good. So thank you. Take it away. I'm sure we would now that I've never used that many adjectives in a row for years. I mean, but it was well worth it. And I'm sure we all want to hear from you now and answer the questions that people have to ask you.
Well, Thank you so much. That was quite an intro. So yeah, let me briefly describe the novel for those who aren't familiar with it. It's set mostly in Berlin and mostly in the spring of 1945, in the last months of the war in Europe. Berlin at the time was little more than a pile of rubble, and the Russians were advancing on the city and were soon to occupy it. The novel follows the odyssey of a German boy, Tobias Kurtig, through the ruined city and beyond. He's an orphaned 13-year-old who loves to draw, which is important to his character and the plot. And he's coerced into joining the German Youth Army to fight in the last desperate and futile battles. He's mistaken for a hero on the Eastern Front. He receives an Iron Cross from Hitler himself, who discovers the boy's cartoons and appoints Tobias to sketch pictures of the ruined city, to be the Führer's eyes above the bunker. And shuttling between the insanity of the Führer's bunker and the chaotic streets, Tobias must contend with a scheming Martin Bormann, a deceitful deserter, the Russian onslaught, and his own compounding despair, all while falling for Zenzi, a girl whose family has been identified by the Nazis as a so-called Mischling, meaning part Jewish, and who relays secret news of death camps, convincing Tobias and herself to make a treacherous escape to the Americans. So that's the summary of the plot. And let me explain the term Mischling. It was a derogatory term meaning half-breed or part Jewish. The Nazis had two categories of Mischling. A first-degree Mischling was a non-Jewish person who had married someone Jewish, and a second-degree Mischling was a child of a mixed marriage or a non-Jewish person with a Jewish grandparent. The treatment of Mischling varied. Those of the first degree were sometimes deported to the camps or to labor battalions, but not always. And there were many exemptions. And those of the second degree were considered by the Nazis to actually be racially pure, but there were exceptions here too. The whims of a lower level official could determine one's fate. A central character in the novel, Zenzi, she's a 15-year-old girl who is a second-degree Mischling with a great-grandparent who was Jewish. She and her family have remained in Berlin, but they fear that the SS may start rounding up all Mischling, and this forms a central element of the novel's drama. Though she isn't Jewish, Zenzi is drawn closer and closer to the plight of the Jews under Hitler as the story progresses, as she hears and secretly reads news of the death camps. Eventually, she embraces a Jewish identity for herself. All right, I'm going to just read the intro, the first 2 pages of the novel, very short, just to give you an idea of the voice of Tobias. It begins as a letter that he has written in 2016 at the age of 84 to the chief of police of a small town on the coast of New Jersey called Misty Hook. Please read all of this. Please save any judgment until the end, for I am writing to request your help a second time in locating a thief, a man I once knew, a crazy man who has come back into my life from long ago, from the war, to torment me again. He has taken the only thing I cannot lose. Because your officer, Sergeant Toomis, sorry if the spelling is wrong, did not seem to believe anything I said when he investigated the robbery last week, I will repeat the details now with a calmer head. My name is Tobias Reisner, born Tobias Kurtig in 1932 in Berlin, U.S. citizen living in Misty Hook at 39 Monroe Lane, age 84, and of sound mind. I'm a loyal taxpayer too, though my income is meager, only Social Security and a little cash from portraits. In the warmer months, with fading talent, I sell quick charcoal sketches of people at the nearby shore. On March 31st, I drew a cheerful lady and her daughter for $15, visited Margot's bakery to eat a jelly donut, and then came home to find my apartment in disarray. I admit that I am not a careful housekeeper, that the 3 small rooms never look entirely clean, but it was obvious that someone had ransacked the place. Cabinet doors were flung open, drawers lay upended on the floor, their junk scattered everywhere. The television, however, had not disappeared, and a jar of laundry coins also remained untouched. This was no ordinary thief. Then I discovered that Feigling had been scrawled in charcoal on the closet wall, and that the rusty Maxwell House can hidden in that closet was tipped over, emptied of the only item it contained, the medal. My heart flipped. Feigling, if you do not know, is German for coward, and the medal, I am distressed to type it just as I was distressed to reveal it to Sergeant Toomis. The medal is the Iron Cross, awarded to German soldiers for battlefield valor. There was no doubt. Werner Fenzel had been here. Nothing could be more ridiculous. Fenzel, my old commander and antagonist, slipping into my bedroom like a phantom. Still obsessed, still unhinged, with those misaligned eyes and his ever-present fury, now almost 90, finally possessing what he always prized, what he claimed would have gone to him in the spring of 1945 if the Russians hadn't shot off his nose. In fact, I had done nothing heroic. A scared and scrawny boy, a poor soldier, I received the medal through a misunderstanding, which pushed Fenzel into madness and then led to everything else. To the tyrant, to heavy burdens, to end-of-world misery, to flashes of love, to a makeshift wedding in the ruins, to the final river. That is why I never discarded this token of war, and why I need it returned. It holds all that. It forces me to remember what I would mostly rather forget. Of course, I must explain. So I will tell the whole story now on paper from start to finish. Bless Fraulein Krukenberg, even though she took her ruler to my knuckles for making me a decent typist. Forgive any errors, a few keys are sticky. I falter sometimes with English, and I do not have a razor ribbon. But all of what follows is true. So those are the opening pages. And what I'm going to do now is go over some images, some slides I have of Berlin from the era that roughly follow a chronological order of the novel. I'm going to share the screen. So this is Berlin soon after the war. You can see that it's basically a total ruin. There's no roofs for anything. Everything looks like a sort of a sandcastle that's been swept over by a wave. The city was bombed continuously for 5 years, as were other German cities. And it's estimated that 600,000 civilians died in Germany as a result of the air raids. Now, interestingly, accounts of life during that time are few in number. W.G. Sebald, author of the celebrated novel, The Rings of Saturn, and other novels, wondered why this was so. In his last published book, a book of essays, he wrote a long piece on the subject and suggested that the massive bombing of Germany doesn't occupy much space in the German cultural memory because both outsiders and the citizens themselves felt to some extent that they deserved it. The number of 600,000 is of course dwarfed by the massacre of 6 million Jews and millions in other groups. The bombing of civilian targets was intended to break morale, but it never really did. And the Nazi fat cats were relatively safe in the Führer's bunker and well supplied, continuing the defense of Berlin until virtually nothing was left. For a city of Berlin's population, the casualty rate from the bombing was not as high as elsewhere. Around 50,000 died in Berlin from the air raids over 5 years. Compare that to the loss of 30,000 to 40,000 people in a single night in the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden. Berlin was less prone to firestorms because many of the buildings were stone and the streets were fairly wide. Just getting back for a moment to Sebald, I seem to have a small literary connection with him. I recently read his novel, The Emigrants, and was surprised to find that one of his characters, who appears only in a single sentence, is named Zenzi, which is actually a rather uncommon name, and why I chose it. So it was sort of unusual to come across that. Okay. All right, here's more ruins. This is the famous Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Lots of debris in front of it. Now, ironically, the sculpture on top has 4 horses leading a chariot driven by the Roman goddess of victory. Now, only one of the horses remained intact after the fall of Berlin. Apparently, a replica of the gate was built during the war and placed in a different location to confuse enemy bombers about the locations of their targets. This is what was called the zoo bunker. It was on the grounds of the Berlin Zoo. It was a massive, massive bunker. The residents of Berlin, they had some options for seeking shelter from the bombs. There were basements, of course, which afforded more privacy, but the risk was having the building come down on you. There were several underground bomb shelters, like the one that Tobias works in at the beginning of the novel. These were, however, crowded, dank, foul-smelling places by the end of the war, with no working toilets or running water and no lights. There were also the underground stations of the U-Bahn, the subway. But perhaps the safest place in Berlin from the bombing was this bunker you see here. It was above ground, but it was massive. It had walls of concrete 8 feet thick and was virtually indestructible. In fact, after the war, the authorities had difficulty demolishing it. On the roof, there were 4 anti-aircraft guns, and these would fire continuously during air raids. As I mentioned, it was right on the grounds of the zoo, and I can't imagine how the animals tolerated the noise. I'll get to the zoo in a moment. The ground floor of the bunker was designed to hold 8,000 civilians during the air raids. However, as people lost their homes, more and more started coming to the bunker, which at the height of the bombing was said to have housed 30,000 people, cramped together for hours and doing everything that human beings do in the course of a day. The structure also housed a hospital and a storage area for art treasures from Berlin museums, including antiquities supposedly from ancient Greece. Now, this is a significant plot point in the novel because Tobias makes several visits to this zoo bunker, including the room with the treasures. Here's another view of the same bunker from the front. That's I think the building in front is part of the zoo. Refugees fleeing a burning city. And at the end in the spring of 45, it was nearly impossible to leave as the Soviets had encircled it by mid-April of 1945. Germany would surrender on May 8th. Now, as I was researching the book, scenes like this seemed to be from a vastly different historical period, scenes that surely would never occur again. And yet, here we are, almost 80 years after the end of the World War II, and we're seeing similar widespread destruction in Ukraine now with similar scenes like this. Here's the zoo, a photo from the zoo. This is the hippo, one of the hippos in the zoo at the time. If you look closely, you can see rubble in the background. In 1945, there were 2 hippos left at the zoo, Rosa and her baby Nauchka. Nauchka would manage to survive the war. The zoo, of course, was a very sad place. The bombings had killed a lot of animals, or they had simply starved to death. And there were stories of tigers and lions having escaped and roaming the streets, but they are largely apocryphal, I think. One story, which Zenzi repeats in the novel, is that an escaped tiger wandered into a candy shop and died after eating all the chocolate. Probably not true. The novel has 2 scenes at the zoo, both involving Pongo the gorilla. At the end of the war, Pongo was found dead in his cage along with an SS officer. The scenario was certainly odd, and as a fiction writer, I invented a reason for it, which makes for one of the stranger scenes in the book. This is a schematic of Hitler's bunker. This was the seed of my novel, although the idea of the novel came to me, as story ideas usually do, by happenstance. I've been working on a nonfiction book about war, and as I was researching it, I somehow ended up reading Alan Bullock's 1,000-page tome that compares Hitler and Stalin. And at the end, Bullock examines the insanity of the Führer bunker. Now, I had always imagined it as a small, cramped enclosure with Hitler cowering inside, but not so. As you can see, it was a vast labyrinth, complete with meeting rooms, storerooms, a large kitchen, a surgical ward, a dental facility, and so on. And at the end, it was a buzzing hive of desperation, delusion, and considerable debauchery. A perfect setting, it suddenly seemed to me, for fiction. But how was I going to get inside the bunker with a sympathetic character? I certainly wasn't going to write from the perspective of a dedicated Nazi, though Jonathan Little had done this in his controversial novel, The Kindly Ones. But then I read about the ceremony held outside the bunker on April 20th, 1945, for Hitler's 56th birthday, in which the Führer presented 19 boys with the Iron Cross. There was my answer, a boy who would be in the novel the uncounted 20th. But to further separate the character from diehard beliefs, a boy who was there by accident. And further, a dreamy boy who loved to draw spaceships, just as I did at Tobias's age. Now, it's a pivotal scene in the book as it brings Tobias back from the front lines to Berlin and inside the bunker, where he's given an unusual assignment, which is to be Hitler's eyes above the street, above the bunker. This photograph, by the way, is sometimes labeled as being from April 20th of 1945, but it's actually from an earlier year, because by April of 45, Hitler was a decrepit shell of a man, not looking like this at all. He was on all sorts of drugs with gray skin and drooping yellow eyes and a constantly twitching arm. This is a page from the English translation of the Verba-Wetzler report, sometimes called the Auschwitz Protocols. Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler were Slovakian Jews who managed to escape the Auschwitz death camp in April of 1944. And their horrific descriptions of the camp were soon collected into a 33-page report, along with sketches they had made, and it was printed by at least a couple of Swiss newspapers. Zenzi, in the novel, gets her hands on a smuggled copy of one of these papers and secretly shows Tobias the report. And it's another pivotal scene in the book, as Tobias, who has been skeptical of the existence of death camps, is horrified in particular by the description of bodies being turned into fertilizer. The news finally pushes him in to an escape from Berlin with Zenzi to reach the Americans. By April of 1945, the defeat of Germany and the occupation of Berlin was a foregone conclusion to the war. At this point, German forces had dwindled and much of the city was being defended by poorly trained old men or boys, some as young as 12. The last vicious battles were completely unnecessary, but Hitler in his bunker was demanding the final defense, and his delusional or weak-willed generals were still carrying out his orders. By late April, the Soviets had surrounded the city and were going building to building, firing point-blank howitzers and within tanks, and then eliminating any surviving resistance with flamethrowers. It was very brutal. This photo, like many taken by the Soviets at the end of the war, is possibly staged. The Russians knew they were going to be victorious and were photographing and even filming scenes for the purposes of propaganda. Tobias in the novel comes across a strange staged scene, which makes for a surreal moment, and it's also another pivotal moment in the novel. This is probably one of the most famous pictures from the fall of Berlin, the raising of the Russian flag on the roof of the Reichstag, where one of the last significant battles took place, even though the Reichstag was essentially an abandoned building during the Hitler years. It was used only for occasional ceremonial affairs. But of course, it was symbolic of victory for the Russians. Now, once the Russians occupied the city, there began a pretty widespread attack on German women and girls of all ages with acts of rape. The number of rape victims is estimated at about 100,000, and possibly 10,000 died as a result. This is a horrific aspect of the Soviet victory, which also occurs in my novel, and had not actually gotten much attention until more recently. A memoir titled A Woman in Berlin, originally published in 1959 by an anonymous author who was later identified, brought attention to the subject when it was reissued in 2003, and it was later made into a movie. This is a picture of Martin Bormann. By the end of the war, he was second only to Hitler in his power. He was brutal and a conniver, and those qualities appealed to Hitler, who trusted Bormann more than anyone. Bormann, who joined the crew in the bunker in January of 45, completely controlled access to Hitler, but worked entirely behind the scenes. Very few Germans knew his name. He has a significant role in the novel, as Tobias finds himself entrapped by the man's manipulative efforts at self-preservation. Now, for many years, there were rumors of Bormann's escape to South America, and a little bit of trivia here about that. You might remember the original 1971 version of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. A golden ticket, which turns out to be forged, is found by a man in Paraguay. The photograph of that man is the same one here, Martin Bormann. It's an odd little joke for a kid's movie, certainly. Now, a year later, in 1972, Bormann's bones were actually discovered in Berlin along a set of railroad tracks where his fellow Nazi, Arthur Axmann, claimed to have seen his body, along with a doctor named Stumpfeger. It wasn't until 1998, though, that the skull was positively identified as Bormann's. Speaking of Axmann, Arthur Axmann, there he is. He was the leader of the Hitler Youth and was personally responsible for sending thousands of poorly trained boys, some as young as 12, to their deaths in battle. He remained one of Hitler's faithful followers right up until the end, and was still sending out boys as cannon fodder in the final months of the defense of Berlin. He fled the bunker after Hitler's death and survived, though he was actually declared dead for a while. This allowed him to reconnect with former members of the Hitler Youth to plan some sort of neo-Nazi conspiracy. This is also in my novel. But the plot was discovered and he was arrested in December of 1945. Eventually, he was tried and convicted and spent a little over 3 years in prison. And in the late 50s, he was tried again for the indoctrination of youth and convicted, but this time he only had to pay a fine. His punishments really amounted to a slap on the wrist compared to others. In fact, he became a salesman for a coffee company for a while, and then later ran a Spanish resort. He published an autobiography with the rather incredible title of "This Can't Be the End," which sounds like a lament over the defeat of the Nazi regime. I can't verify what this actual subject of the book is because I have been unable to find an English translation of the book, which seems incredible to me that one doesn't exist, but I searched and searched and couldn't find one. Now, for many who remained in the bunker after Hitler's death on April 30th of 1945, including Bormann and Esstman, a desperate escape plan was concocted. My character, Tobias, gets caught up in these plans, though I won't reveal more than that. The idea was to rush from the bunker to the nearest U-Bahn station, which was the Berlin subway, and make your way through the subway tunnels until you could pop out above ground outside the Russian encirclement, and then somehow make your way north to the city of Schwerin, which lies near the Baltic Sea. Bormann seemed to have another idea, as he was trying to meet up with Hitler's pilot, Hans Bauer. In an excellent book simply titled The Bunker, author James O'Donnell speculates that there was a small plane that Bormann and Bauer were headed for to attempt an escape by flying. Bormann started off as the others did in the subway tunnels, but Bormann's group soon became lost and had to surface. They managed to make it across one bridge under Russian fire, and Bormann seemed to be headed to the train station. Possibly this is where the plane was. He ended up finding Esstman, and they continued together until they came across a Russian patrol. Bormann and Esstman had discarded their uniforms, and the Russians, possibly drunk, likely drunk, mistook them for civilians. Bormann soon split off with the doctor named Stumpfegger, but they both died, possibly by cyanide, on the railroad tracks leading to the station. Esstman claimed to have seen their bodies, and this is where their bones were found years later by a construction crew. All of this appears in the novel with some fictional additions. Here's a scene of a bridge over the River Elbe, a destroyed bridge with civilians trying to cross. So most refugees tried to escape Berlin by heading west to the Americans, who were on the western side of the River Elbe, which lies about 60 miles west of Berlin. Now, on the western side of the bridge, as I just said, were the Americans. They had been ordered to halt their advance there at the western edge and leave the conquest of Berlin to the Russians. The Americans were processing refugees on the western side, but Russians, at least until the surrender of Germany on May 8th, were still lobbing shells onto any remnants of the German army and onto civilians on the eastern side and crossing the bridge. So it was a dire situation until the very last stretch. A lot of people did manage to escape Berlin and the Russians in the final month of the war, following path clearing efforts by General Wenck's 12th Army to reach the Americans and surrender to them. But if you made it to the western side of the bridge and registered as a refugee with the Americans, you weren't quite free. You were sent to displaced person camps, or DP camps, which in some cases weren't much better than the concentration camps. Here's a scene from one of the DP camps. Millions of people had been displaced from their homes by the war, and many found their way back to their countries and cities of origin. But by late 1945, there were still 1 million people unable to return home for various reasons. And they remained in DP camps, in some cases for years. In 1948, the US passed the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed about 50,000 Jewish refugees into the country, so long as you hadn't expressed any pro-communist views. Other Jewish refugees went to the newly formed state of Israel. Orphans were also given priority and were adopted by US families, a process that must have been extraordinarily difficult for the children who had just suffered through a brutal war, and also one that is part of the novel. Astonishingly, the last of the European DP camps didn't shut down until 1959, 14 years after the war had ended. Well, that ends my presentation. So I guess at this point, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, and for questions, you can type those in the chat window and I'll keep up and I can read those out, but I'm also going to give people the chance to unmute. So if you'd raise your hand and we can call on people, if you use the hand raise function, or if it's quiet, you can just unmute and ask a question. So please bring your questions. Tara, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, so this is related to Barbara's comments when she, mentioned opening the book and seeing, oh, this, well-documented history coming up in a novel again. Did you have thoughts around that as you were writing, thinking, what am I doing? How do I make this different? How did you contend with that well-traveled history of this, this era being the central point, or the focal point of novels?
Yeah, I think one of my aims was to highlight the absurdity of war, and to bring some Black humor to the novel, and to describe the absolute insanity and craziness of the fall of Berlin. I felt it hadn't, I knew it hadn't really come out in fiction that way, the fall of Berlin. There weren't really much in the way of fiction about it. So I guess that was my new take. And plus I was, doing it from the point of view of a German boy. And this is also a little unusual in fiction of World War II, that the German perspective is not often shown. So
thank you.
Is there anybody else with a question? Again, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask a question. Barbara?
Yeah, you seem to have written a lot of nonfiction before this novel. So how did you find making that transition between writing nonfiction and fictionalizing it?
well, I had written a lot of nonfiction. So I had worked for the Village Voice as an art critic, but I had actually written a lot of fiction before this novel. It's my first published novel, but it's not my first written novel. So I had a couple previous novels, both of which had found agents, but neither of which had been picked up. So I wasn't completely inexperienced at writing a novel, but but it never gets easier.
Yeah, I know.
In fact,
that part.
in fact, writing a historical novel is just a huge challenge, and I'm not sure if I would ever do it again.
From the chat, could you talk a little bit more about the path to publication for this novel?
Yeah. So in a an earlier version of the novel found an agent, and she shopped it around to all the big publishers. And I got some decent comments, some nice comments, even some blurb worthy comments, but no one, alas, wanted to publish it. So that was frustrating. And finally, the agent ran out of possibilities, and so that was that. And so in my frustration, I put the novel away for a while. I ended up writing another one on a completely different subject, and then came back to this a few years later with fresh eyes, and realized that, yes, there are certain things that could be cut, things that could be changed, the pace could be quickened a little bit, and so forth. So I did that. And of course, I wasn't going to be able to find an agent again, but I started submitting it to contests. And I submitted it to the AWP novel contest, and it ended up winning. So that was the path of publication. That the winner of that contest is published by a small press, which is New Issues Press. So that's how it came. That's how it came to be.
Great. Again, from the chat, there's a question. How did you handle the issue of that the characters are speaking a language other than English? Do you speak German? Did you use much German in the dialogue? And did you have a native speaker to review your usage?
I don't speak German, but I did want them to. I did want German occasionally. The narrator has been in the U.S. for many, many years, so he speaks English himself. But I did want the German language to be represented here and there, so that the reader would be reminded, of course, that all this is taking place in Germany, and that there are certain expressions in German that I wanted to highlight. And so, yes, there is some German in the novel, but it is typically translated immediately in right afterwards. I think maybe I use italics for that. Sometimes I have the character Zenzi, who is a cultured 15-year-old, and she knows English. And so she, at the end of the novel, when they were trying to meet the Americans, she translates some of her German into English for Tobias. And so I handled that in that respect. And for the German that I did include in the novel, I did have a native German speaker check the grammar and make sure it was okay. So I have some sort of slangy kind of expressions in there that I wanted to get right. In fact, the whole novel I wanted to get right. Because the Tobias is basically writing a memoir. He's trying to explain himself, and the last line of the introduction, he claims that everything he writes is true. So I wanted that. I wanted everything in the novel to be plausible, to be believable, even the most outlandish scenes. And there are certainly outlandish scenes in the novel, fantastical scenes, but I wanted them still to be plausible. So yeah, I made great effort to make sure every detail was right. Great.
Jeffrey, I see you have your hand raised if you'd like to unmute and ask a question.
Good evening, everyone. Robert, I'm curious, you mentioned a few other novels. I wonder if they're also historical fiction, and what about historical fiction interests you? And what other time periods and cultures and interest you in, that you might be writing about?
You're talking about the novels I've written? Yeah. Well, this is my only historical novel. I mean, I guess you could say that every novel you write is historical, because it takes place somewhere, unless you're writing science fiction and set in the future. But my first novel was a novel about sort of a bumbling con man. My tastes are pretty wide ranging. So that was set now actually in a historical period. It was set right after 9/11 in New York City. So that feels almost historical now. I may go back to that one day and do something else with it. It actually came pretty close to being published, but not quite. No cigar. And the second novel was a quirky thing about, it's too complicated to describe. It was also set in contemporary setting. And then I wrote To Zenzi. Frankly, I wrote To Zenzi with the idea of doing a World War II novel because I thought it might actually sell better. It didn't, but that was one motivation for writing a World War II novel. And then the novel after that is a contemporary novel, politically contemporary, and so yeah, nothing really historical. But I have, other than this one, but I have pretty wide-ranging tastes. I like to explore and experiment in what I do. In fact, the one I'm currently working on is it's a literary novel again, but with a sci-fi core. So it's another kind of veering off of what I've done in the past.
Thank you.
So you just covered the next question, which is what are you working on next? And then back to the chat is, how much of your research did you do on site in Berlin?
Interesting question. Well, the fact is, of course, I really thought about going to Berlin to research this book, but I decided fairly early on that I didn't want to do that, because the Berlin that I was writing about was one in total ruin, and I wanted to be immersed in that world of the ruins, and I didn't want modern day Berlin to affect me, to change my perspective. So I decided not to go, and I decided to rely instead on photographs, on footage that I could find, and even on some films that I watched that were made at the end of the war, right after the war, like Roberto Rossellini's Germany Year Zero, which is one of the most depressing films you could probably ever watch. And there's another one called The Search with Montgomery Clift about looking for the parents of a boy, a German boy, that was also shot in post-war Berlin. So for that reason, yeah, I relied on historical footage rather than actually going to the city.
Historical, from this chat window, historical research can be a rabbit hole. How did you balance your fascination with the historical moment with your plotting? Did you write with a detailed outline? And can you please tell us about your writing process?
Yeah, that was really the most challenging thing, because there are so many books written about the fall of Berlin, about this era, and that I read just about everything I could get my hands on. And the challenge, of course, is to assemble all that and take parts of it and figure out how to get it into your plot and how it's going to affect your characters. And that was, took a considerable amount of time. I had a broad outline. I sort of knew maybe 3 or 4 events that were going to happen before I started writing. But as I researched, I would discover these weird things that had happened. And I think, oh, I have to get this into the novel. And it's, and of course, you end up with a list of 100 things that you want to get into the novel, and you can't do that. So you have to pare it down and, find how it's going to affect the plot points of your novel, and what events that actually happen how they might affect the character, how the character might behave or react to these events. And so those were sort of the determining factors, but it was a lot of trial and error. There are certain, scenes that I cut from later versions of the book, and this certainly went through many drafts. So yeah, it was it's a big challenge. As far as the writing process goes, I'm a constant editor, so I will constantly revise what I have written, including entire scenes. The beginning of the book was completely different when I first found an agent for it. It was much longer. It actually had a foreword in addition to the epilogue, and so all that was cut away, and the beginning was just cut down to 2 pages. So yeah, constantly editing, which can drive you crazy. But
I might ask, as someone who wrote an alternate history novel, tons of research.
Yeah.
And there's always, more research by a factor than by factors and factors, and you could possibly include.
yes,
But I never felt like any of that was wasted. I feel like all that influences the novel still, even the stuff you end up cutting. So what's your relationship to the information you have that didn't end up in the novel?
yeah, I sort of came up with this arbitrary rule that that you should know 10 times more about your subject than you're actually going to include in the novel. It initially feels like, oh, it's a waste of time, but it's not. It gives you to know your subject and the historical period and the era and the location, to know it intimately through all the research you do, gives you this sort of confidence to be able to write a character into a scene and know that there are certain limitations of what's there, know what the character is able to do, able to see. It comes more naturally when you know so much about it. And yes, you have to choose your details carefully, because there are a number of historical novels where the writer shows off everything he or she has learned, and it just overwhelms the novel and it just stops the plot. So I tried very hard not to make that mistake. And so, but did feel still, as you said, that all that knowledge you gain is still important, because it really does give you the confidence to set a scene.
Thank you. Any more questions from raised hands or from the chat window? I think that might be our questions then. Robert, I want to thank you so much for coming and joining us, and want to congratulate you face to video face for winning the award.
Yeah.
We're really honored that you're part of the Writer Center community now, and we're really honored that you are the latest recipient of the McLaughlin-Esstman-Stearns First Novel Prize, and we hope that you'll stay in touch with the Writer Center and be part of our family going forward.
Yeah, no, thank you so much to the Writer Center for having this competition with such a generous award attached to it, and thank you to the judges this year for choosing the novel. It's really an honor to have this award.
Well, thank you again, Robert. Thank you, Barbara, for coming and joining us and sharing you and the other judges' thoughts on this. And thank you to everyone who came out and stayed.
Yes.
This was a great presentation, a great Q&A. I've had a wonderful evening. I hope you all do.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for watching.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.